Today marks 4 months since the COVID-19 lockdown in South Africa, and we're looking back. The first nationwide lockdown came into effect on Thursday, the 26th of March. While that was partially eased from the 1st of May, eased further on the 1st of June this year, economic activity has remained restricted somewhat. Alcohol sales have been banned once again, which restaurants say is driving them out of business. Recently, the president announced that the phased reopening of schools would be halted and schools would be closed for a month. Government has said that South Africa has achieved the goal of flattening the curve or delaying the spreading of the infection so that health services are not overwhelmed. Although it's clear after an oxygen shortage in the Eastern Cape, for example, that hospitals are already under severe strain. Tonight we're looking back at the good and the bad, the gains that have been made and the missed opportunities. Let's start by talking to Professor Alex van den Heever, who is Chair of Social Security at the Wits School of Governance. Professor, thank you. We recently had you on this show and you were highly critical of what's been happening in the Eastern Cape, for example. To what extent could that have been prevented, what's happening in hospitals there? And to what extent does that province reflect problems across South Africa right now?
I think quite a lot could have been prevented in terms of both the scale of the epidemic as well as the impact on the hospital services themselves. It appears as though the period of the lockdown, the supposed breathing space that would be created by it was not exploited at all, and it looks as though that a lot of the funds that were made available to address the epidemic during that period were in fact corruptly distributed. And I think that is a serious concern, because it appears as though the actual operationalization of many facets of the interventions have not been done in a way that was focused on addressing the epidemic. And that is cause for concern, and it appears more widespread than the Eastern Cape.
Do we know how widespread it is? And do you at least respect the transparency of the president a few days ago being very open about that corruption, talking about the inflated prices, saying that the Special Investigative Unit, for example, he's issued a proclamation. They can investigate all COVID-19 related expenditure. They will report back to him, and various departments are going to be involved in that as well.
Well, we've had an SIU for many years, and it doesn't seem to have had much impact on politically orchestrated corruption to date. And neither has the National Prosecuting Authority. So there is a question as to whether or not our sort of meta-governance structures that we have in place are sufficiently independent to move forward, because you can make very strong statements about addressing corruption, which, when it comes down to it, mean very little in terms of changing anything on the ground. So I would rather not have worked. I would rather see action at this point, and we're not seeing it.
You said something interesting, that it's yielded no benefits. I mean, the lockdown has come at a huge economic cost for South Africa. Surely we must have achieved something. Government talks about the flattening of the curve. Aren't there some numbers there? Or are you really saying that no lockdown would have been better than what we've done?
So there's a question as to what people have understood as to what the purpose of the lockdown would be. And I've seen conflicting bits of information come out from government. On the one hand, people have talked about pushing out the peak to some sort of period at which they could introduce changes to the health services so they could manage the so-called peak. The correct strategy was that you introduced a little bit of a delay because we're not prepared, in order to introduce non-pharmaceutical interventions to suppress the epidemic without a lockdown. That was our only strategy. And if you introduce that strategy, we do not face these peaks. South Africa has now got an expanding epidemic, which at most, all we achieved with the lockdown was to defer the epidemic we were going to have anyway. And it appears as though no investment was put into prevention, and no investment and very little investment was put into additional services. So it doesn't really make sense. It's totally unclear what people thought their strategy was in government.
Yeah. So the Solidarity Fund, the coordinated efforts to buy PPE, to procure ventilators from overseas, the field hospitals, there does seem to have been some movement, Professor.
Yeah, so in the Western Cape, they introduced real field hospitals, which had oxygen running to all the beds, and they were able to staff it. And as a consequence, they were able to prevent an overflow onto the private sector, which in fact is bearing a significant part of the brunt of the epidemic just through private patients at this point in time. But what we've seen in terms of field hospitals in the other provinces is a joke. So the Nasrec facility that was introduced after such a long period of time did not have oxygen fed to it. It looked as though there was very, very poor preparation for oxygen supplies, despite the fact it was very, very clear we were going to need them.
Yeah.
So now we have 3 provinces now
Prof, can I stop you there, because you did speak about this once before, and I spoke to the health minister after that. He said it was initially a quarantine site that was needed, and the oxygen, etc., would come a little later.
So have they used it for quarantining? I mean, it's unclear what they've actually used those beds for other than a photo opportunity. The Nasrec facility was meant to deal with a severe epidemic and to take, as was used in the Western Cape, was to prevent you having to move patients, so keep patients at a general ward setting with oxygen and able to be supported so that you could avert people going in for critical care. It appears as though there was no clear strategy behind Nasrec. So now, in terms of quarantining facilities, we shut down our entire hospitality industry in South Africa. All of those facilities were available for quarantining. So those would have been the natural sites. We didn't have to create a quarantining facility at Nasrec. What we needed was potential beds in case there was a need, in case we didn't completely contain the epidemic. But what I'm saying is that we prepared for neither of the 2 contingencies that were clearly going to occur if you didn't manage the epidemic. You needed a prevention strategy and you needed a treatment contingency. Yeah. And effectively, we ended up with neither.
Professor, this is all sort of bolstering critics of the way government is going about the National Health Service as well. It would be centralized. You know, if there's corruption at the COVID-19 peak, what about then with a centralized system? Let's just clarify what you're saying here, that the lockdown achieved nothing for South Africa except economic pain. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we incurred massive economic cost for almost no health prevention and no health treatment benefit. It has been an incredibly costly exercise and clearly wasn't thought through all the way through. And if we had to look at proposals like national health insurance, well, let's go back to procurement. It is very, very obvious that the points of corruption in any major system are around procurement and appointments. And becoming single gatekeepers for licensing anything. And what we're seeing is all 3 of those being used during this COVID crisis, all very predictable areas of risk. Now, none of the procurement platforms that were set up were inoculated against that risk. They were left exposed. So we could have created a centralized platform that used all of our capabilities in South Africa to procure PPE, or anything else that we needed for this on an urgent basis, and created that in a very accountable procurement structure. But it looks like there was a deliberate attempt to create procurement structures that were compromised from the beginning. And this is where I have a concern with the president suddenly saying he's now worried about all the corruption. Yeah. The point is, it was preventable, just like the epidemic. It was preventable from the beginning. It comes down to how you set these systems up. These systems were set up to allow corruption. And that's why I don't believe, until we see people going to jail or changes to these structures, I don't believe what the president is saying.
All right. Thank you for your analysis tonight, Professor Alex van den Heever, who is the chair of Social Security at the Wits School of Governance.